Great. All right. Once again, good evening, everyone. I'm going to start talking. I'm going to be doing a lot of talking this call, which is not usually how XR meetings go, but I hope you'll bear with me. So this is, as the first slide states, what is XR India? And it's an open meeting call, and it'll go over a lot of general things. So there's two parts to this presentation. The first is we'll talk a little bit about the most contemporary climate science and what exactly indicates that we're in the middle of a climate and ecological crisis. And the second part is what to actually do about it. So once you hear all the bad news, what exactly are we going to do about it? And specifically, what does Extinction Rebellion do about it? So to start off with, we have the enhanced greenhouse effect. Now, I'm sure many people have heard about the greenhouse effect, which is actually a good thing, right? This is the thing that allows life to exist on this planet. It's what allows optimal temperatures for life to flourish. Now, what's been happening due to human activity? We've been causing this thing called the enhanced greenhouse effect. And the enhanced greenhouse effect is us as humans, we're emitting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which actually traps more radiation in our Earth and actually lets less radiation escape, which is the phenomena that we kind of know as global warming. But it is linked to this enhanced greenhouse effect. All right. So moving forward, if there's one slide or one graph that I would request everyone to imprint in their mind, it's this one. So this graph is actually quite scary, right? And I think it's one of the most important graphs that show you that all of climate change or the climate crisis we find ourselves in is entirely human driven. So this is a graph produced by NASA, which shows on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, time in the years of hundreds of thousands, right? And there's natural flows of carbon dioxide in levels. That's the y-axis. It's showing us how much carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere. So, atmospheric carbon dioxide has fluctuated, and these natural fluctuations, which are part of the Earth's geological surface, are known as the Milankovitch cycles. Now, these Milankovitch cycles are totally normal, but if you look at this point where it says 0, that's actually 1950. That's kind of when the Industrial Revolution began and humans began emitting carbon dioxide at insane levels. So you'll see that it's basically a straight line upward from there. This is also known as a hockey stick because according to these natural phenomena, we should be in the middle of an ice age right now. But unfortunately, we have just skyrocketed and increased our carbon dioxide levels by an insane amount. And this is entirely human caused, which is known as the anthropogenic emissions. Okay, so some of you may have heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is kind of the leading climate scientists around the world. They publish these reports, which many of us may have come across. And in 2018, they published this really important report, which is known as the 1.5 degrees report. Now, I want to talk about how the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, how they're actually quite a conservative body. So there's three reasons for this. The first reason that the IPCC is conservative, you can see in this graph. So the black line shows you the mean IPCC models, like that's kind of what they predict. And what they're predicting in this particular graph is how quickly our Arctic sea ice is disappearing. So according to this prediction, it'll be around, till 2100. But if we actually look at the observations, the actual climate science, which is the red line, what actually happens is that our Arctic sea ice is disappearing very, very, very rapidly. And it might be disappearing in the next 5 to 10 years, not 2100 as they expected. So this is the first reason the IPCC is conservative. It's because it requires, whenever they make models, they often take a very high level of estimation. They try to take the most conservative estimate, which is often like the furthest thing away from the observations. Also because scientists don't fully understand actually how the Earth works. And I'll talk about this in a little bit longer. The second reason why the IPCC is conservative is because actually it's not just a panel of scientists. So even though we say there are climate scientists who are sitting on it, there's also politicians and diplomats sitting on this panel because it is a UN body. And in order for any IPCC report to be published, every single country has to agree to the findings that are published in the report, which includes countries that are massive climate deniers, such as the US, Saudi Arabia, and Australia, right? So again, even the most climate denying countries have to agree to something being pushed in a report. The third reason is that the IPCC's data is actually 8 years outdated. because every IPCC report comes out every 5 years. But in order for something to be published in that fifth year, it needs to actually be peer reviewed and published in a separate journal. And that process takes another 2 to 3 years. So every single data point that is in the 2018 report is actually from around 2010. So we actually aren't even finding out what is happening in the recent time. So when the IPCC says that we need a radical transformation in our society, and they're the ones saying that, we should take that really, really seriously, because they are still quite a conservative body to be getting our information from. So one thing that's really scary about the current climate crisis that we find ourselves in is that we are seeing positive feedback loops being initiated. Now, there's nothing positive about any of these feedback loops, okay, even though they're called positive feedback loops. So an example of this is the albedo effect, which is what you're seeing in this slide, in which the temperature rising causes the Arctic sea ice to melt. And as the Arctic sea ice melts, the white ice, which is reflective, disappears, and the darker ocean water ends up absorbing the heat, which is really problematic, which again causes temperature rise and again causes Arctic sea ice to melt. So it creates this really vicious cycle, and that's what's known as a positive feedback loop, is that it positively causes more damage to our ecosystems. And this is really awful, because once these things get initiated, we can't really stop them. So I was reading somewhere the other day that actually an Arctic sea ice shelf that was expected to disappear 70 years from now, the entire shelf has already melted. So we're losing things at rates that we can't even imagine. And that's why we're calling it the climate crisis and not just climate change or global warming, because we actually are in the middle of a crisis. And one big issue is that actually everything that we're seeing right now, all of the global warming, the climate change, the crisis that we find ourselves in, is happening much, much faster than we think. So in 2018, there was this paper published called The Hothouse Earth, which I really encourage everyone to read if you have the time or the energy, which talks about these planetary tipping points. So we were talking about, positive feedback loops, and this is interlinked with that concept, which is that when there are certain global temperature rises, say between 1 to 3 degrees or 3 to 5 degrees or above 5 degrees, certain tipping points get activated, and that causes runaway climate breakdown. And so those are fancy words for saying that it'll initiate certain positive feedback loops that will ensure certain amounts of mass destruction that we as human beings no longer have the ability to control. So no carbon capture technology can save us, none of our current technologies. We have no idea what to do once these tipping points get activated. So as you can see, in 1 to 3 degrees, the reason why we're seeing ice sheets melt is because the Greenland ice sheet, the Arctic summer sea ice, the alpine glaciers, and even the coral reefs, these are the things that reach their tipping points in this state. And we've already seen massive losses in these ecosystems. And if we get ourselves to the point of 3 to 5 degrees, we're currently around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees globally on average, we're going to see things like everything that's in the purple color. So these tipping points, once they get activated again, we have no idea what the damage is going to be to our planet. And another thing that kind of tells us that things are happening faster than our models say that we do is this graph on the right, which shows IPCC projections in brown. And then it shows, again, how the IPCC is conservative, because other climate models that are also published by climate scientists and peer-reviewed show a much, a warming that occurs a decade earlier than the IPCC projections. So the IPCC says we're going to reach 1.5 degrees globally by 2040, and climate models actually say we're going to reach there by 2030, which is a decade away. And you can see the observations show a slight fluctuation, but eventually are actually converging to our climate models, which is really, really scary. We have less than a decade before some of these hothouse states are reached. Okay, so this graph really makes my heart sink. And that's because it shows actually how bad the situation is. So it's a complicated graph, and I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but these are the key points that you need to take away from it, which is that currently we are at 2018, we're around here. I'm not sure if my mouse is showing, but I hope it is. And if we continue business as usual, do absolutely nothing, by 2100, we are headed for 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius of warming. Now, just to put that into context, every single climate report, every single warning that we've received is for a 2-degree warning, which is meant to cause catastrophic consequences to our planet. It's going to be absolutely fatal. And 4.1 to 4.8, I mean, scientists can't even imagine what the consequences of something like that is. And that's where we're headed in, less than a century if we don't stop what we're doing right now. If we go ahead with our current policies, we're still headed for 3.1 to 3.5 degrees of global warming. Again, 2 or 1.5 is the point at which we're saying we can't pass. So 3.1 to 3.5 is actually still extremely devastating. If we have optimistic policies, that means we do a little bit better around the world than we're doing right now, we're headed for 3 degrees. If we meet our Paris Agreement targets, pledges and targets, we're headed for 2.7 to 3 degrees. Notice how we're still not able to get anywhere close to 2 degrees or 1.3 degrees under the current scenario. So even if every single country meets its pledges and targets from the Paris Agreement, we're still really, really screwed. And so 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, if you actually look at the slope for those things, we need to cut our emissions in almost half in the next decade. And if not like more than that, we need to actually go carbon neutral by around 2060, 2070. And we have to actually go negative. Like we have to actually be absorbing carbon from the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere if we want a chance at the 1.5 degree frame. So this in total is meant to tell you that we're in a really scary situation and we need radical change right now, because everything that we're doing that seems possible in the realm of possibility is not going to be enough. That's going to lead us to 3 degrees for sure. Okay, so why are we called Extinction Rebellion? Why do we keep talking about this word extinction, right? I mean, so the reason we do that is because we find ourselves right now in the 6th mass extinction event on this planet. It's important to keep in mind that the previous 5 mass extinctions that have happened on this planet did not happen while Homo sapiens were actually on this planet. And they happened over, millions of years ago, and they happened over like tens of thousands of years periods. So these mass extinctions didn't happen in 50 years like this one. They happened over long time frames, and they were caused by naturally occurring geological phenomena that arise as a result of the need to diversify species. So these are things that are normal, but they were caused, the first 4 of them were caused by a massive increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases, which is exactly what is happening right now. The 5th mass extinction you probably know as the asteroid impact, where the majority of the dinosaurs were killed. One thing is that in all of these different mass extinctions, there's a certain background period of extinction, a rate of extinction at which different species go extinct. Right now, our current mass extinction, we are killing species at 100 times the rate of a normal background extinction rate, 100 times. And that's, an overall average. Some species are dying at, 100, like 1,000 of the rate or 100,000 of the rate. And that's especially true for things like amphibians. We've lost almost 25% of the birds that we actually know. We've also lost about 50% of the mammals we know. So we are losing species at a record rate. And that is extremely terrifying because that's been unprecedented on this planet before. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit away from global climate science, which kind of indicates that everything is really, really, really bad, to talking about India, which also shows that things are really, really, really bad. If you can see the graphs, they're pretty red, at least if you look at where India is, right? So on the global map, we're not in extremely high stress, which like most of the Middle East is, but we are under high stress. And this just basically means we are withdrawing much more from our water tables than we're actually putting back into it. And certain parts of India are much, much more water stressed. So even though around 50% of us are high to extremely high, where I live, which is in Haryana, we're actually in extremely high. So certain regions have a lot more to be afraid of than others, although all of us are going to be extremely affected. Similarly, I'll talk about one other issue, which at least, living in Delhi myself, I know that this is something that is a lived reality for me. I hope it's not the case for you all. But again, 10 of the regularly highest air polluted cities in the world happen to be in India. And I want to talk about how this is not at all a natural phenomenon. There's totally nothing about this that is okay, because if we actually look at our coal and lignite production or our electricity generating capacity, you can see that we are continuing to rely on coal at record rates. We keep opening up new coal mines, new processing factories, and that is not okay, because these are the exact things that are actually a huge part of causing the air pollution that we are breathing in. Although there's other aspects as well, such as vehicular pollution, construction dust, waste burning, etc. But I think one thing that I want to keep drawing our attention to is the fact that our coal production is increasing at record rate, even though we know that exactly coal and other fossil fuels are the exact reason why we are continually headed for this 1.5 to 3 or maybe even 4 degree of global warming, and we yet continue to intentionally cause immense damage to our societies and to the wider ecosystems. And the share of renewables is paltry, right? Like it's less than 18%, and it's growing at a much, much slower rate than the coal is. And unfortunately for us, because of our geological conditions, the Himalayas are actually going to continue to trap a lot of these terrible air quality within the northern regions of our country. And just to give you an example of what this actually means for the human body, there have been doctors who've been studying, lung cancer for a very long time, and they're saying that until recently, every single one of their patients used to be smokers. And now, unfortunately, what's happening is that most of their patients are non-smoking women. And that's a result of exactly a direct correlation to our air pollution. And its air pollution is actually the third largest cause of death in India. So it's not just something that makes our life inconvenient, it is actually literally killing our entire country. So I've just given you a lot of bad news condensed in 20 minutes. There's more bad news, which can be talked about till 40 minutes, but I'm going to stop here for a minute of silence. Because when I think someone hears a lot of this climate science for the first time, it can be extremely overwhelming and it can elicit a lot of different emotional responses. And to acknowledge those emotions, to sit with them, we have this minute of silence, which I'll encourage everyone to observe. So I don't know what exactly you're feeling right now. And since there's quite a few of us on the call, I won't ask everyone to share, but people have all sorts of mixed emotional responses. I've had audiences where people have walked out and needed to take a moment of air. I've had people who've had like tears in their eyes. I've also had people who've been quite confused or in denial. And there's all sorts of emotional responses. You could be scared that this is the reality, this is what we're headed for. You could be feeling ignorant, like, wow, this is just the beginning of the information that I need to actually know. You could be feeling like things are impossible, like how are we going to fix this? Or you could be feeling doubtful, like where is this information coming from? Is this really true? And all of those emotional responses are totally valid, but I just want to encourage everyone to funnel all of those emotions through this funnel of courage, because it's only with courage that we actually have the ability to say, I want to do something about this, because that's what's necessary. We are headed for human extinction and all planetary extinction if we don't take action. So we at XR like to have a second half of the presentation, because often when people give presentations about the climate science, what they do is that they stop at the first half. They say, okay, well, the situation is quite bad. Things are not looking great, but don't worry, we have a solution. Everything's going to be okay. They promise, people make fake promises about what technologies will save us or that our current policies are enough. But we know that that's not the truth. And that's why XR has the second half of the presentation, where we not only tell the truth, which is what we did in the first half, but we have to act as if the truth is actually real. And that's what the second half of the presentation is, learning how to act in accordance with the truth. So some of you may have heard about Extinction Rebellion globally before, because they are a little bit older than us here in India. So the first big action that Extinction Rebellion took was in November 2018, where especially in London, they swarmed one of the main bridges and shut it down for pedestrian and or other traffic to cause some disruption and actually bring attention to the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. Now, XR, where did it actually come from? It comes from actually a long line of social scientific research conducted by these 5 social scientists who were part of this group called Rising Up. And they investigated, over the past 50 years, 60 years, I think from the 1960s to the present, what caused a successful regime change? Like what actually caused systemic change to this, scary problem, that the scary problems of the world that we find ourselves in. And they found that every time 3.5% of a particular population, like a local population or a national population, came together to non-violently address an issue, every time there was successful structural change. So a lot of what what makes XR XR was formed based on a lot of natural scientific and social scientific research. And we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly makes XR XR. But I want to talk about kind of the journey which we've had globally, which is that then on April 2019, it kind of grew from 1 nation to 35 countries. And 35 countries took part in nonviolent direct action in different ways. And then the third big action, which is starting very soon on 7th October, although here in India we're starting on the 6th, is the October International Rebellion. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means within India soon. So, Extinction Rebellion within India. We are officially 2 months old, although we have had social media pages running since about November 2018. But the reason why I say we're 2 months old is because I would say our XR DNA. So we have DNA, as human beings, and that's what separates us from other species on this planet. So I would say the XR DNA, which kind of is the DNA that separates us from other types of social movements that have happened in the past, only really got instated nationally around the country 2 months ago. And let me talk to you a little bit about what the XR DNA is, right? I keep saying this. So the XR DNA is made out of four things. And why is the XR DNA important? It's important because it's what allows XR to be successful as a movement. And there's actual empirical evidence for this. So there have been around 500 chapters around the world, which have allowed some sort of local chapter to declare a national or local, I think especially on the town and county level or even on the state level, all of these things, because of the pressure that XR has put on them, have actually caused a climate crisis or a climate emergency to be declared. So that was a big, big step, right? And XR has actually caused massive climate action plans to be written. It's caused a shift in the way that people think about climate crisis. And we're confident that can happen too in India if we continue to follow the XR DNA. So you can see the map there with all of our 15 chapters currently, and we're hoping to grow even more as time passes. And on the right, you can see one of our most active and big groups, which is XR Vizag, which is I think around almost 100 people. And you can see they're really taking their work seriously. Okay, so I'm now moving on to the things that makes XR, which is our XR DNA. So the first part of our DNA is our demands. What is it actually that we are working towards as XR? So these are our national level demands. And of course, I think the local chapters are coming up with their own demands. But there are three major demands, and I'll talk about them briefly. If anyone has anything pressing that they want to ask, again, I welcome people to unmute themselves. I'm hearing some messaging on the chat, but I'm hoping that I can address it later, if that's okay. So the first demand is tell the truth. And this is something that we think is absolutely essential, which is that we can't actually act on something if we don't actually know the truth behind it. So we want our government at all levels, to declare climate and ecological crisis and communicate this crisis to all citizens and corporations, recognizing the need to rapidly transform our economic system into a sustainable one. So this is what we're doing when we're gathering on the 6th. We're trying to tell the truth. And I'm going to talk about the 6th in a short while. The second is to act now. And this is when the government must enact legally binding policies on restricting carbon emissions, halting biodiversity loss, and securing restorative climate justice for vulnerable communities through a Climate Action Plan 2025 that is based on the latest rigorously peer-reviewed science. So in other parts of the world, which are especially more developed, there are pushes that XRs in their local chapters are making to be carbon neutral by 2025. We recognize that that might not be possible for India, which is why we are asking for a solid, legally binding climate action plan that will, again, give exactly the steps needed for India to transition to be on track with what the IPCC and other reports are demanding. And the third is that we want to create systems that are beyond politics and give power to the people. So how are we going to do this? We are demanding that the government strengthens and transforms the existing systems that empower the people to make decisions on achieving climate and ecological justice with the aid of certified experts and scientists, guided by the idea of citizens' assemblies. So the thing is, we have already in our country democratic structures at the lowest level that allow citizens to take charge of what their own destiny kind of looks like. And we want this to actually be enforced. We don't want it to just be written in the laws. We want to make sure that people actually have the power to make the decisions that they need to do to live ecologically and sustainably and justly. So these are broad architectures. And one thing that I want to mention is that these are not solutions. These are structures that will allow the solutions that we believe already exist. We already have enough scientists, social scientists, native and indigenous populations who know what we need to do to escape this climate crisis. But we just don't have the political will. So XR addresses this issue of political will. And in our demands, what we try to do is ensure that structures emerge that will allow the solutions to also fit into place. Okay, so the next part of our DNA, and I would say that if you have not paid attention to anything so far in this presentation, that you should tune in now, because we're going to go through 10 guiding principles, which is what makes us XR, and which allows any individual to act in the name of XR as long as you are compliant with these 10 guiding principles. And I can assure you, I think these principles have really changed the way that I look at my life, and I think that they will too beyond just your affiliation with XR. So the first is that we have a shared vision of change, which is creating a world fit for generations to come. And this is the shared vision really entails structural change, because we believe that right now the timelines are too dire and too severe for individual action to necessarily be enough. We need systemic change, and we need that to ensure a future fit for further generations. The second is that we've set our mission on what is necessary. So sometimes some things seem impossible, right? Like, how is India going to be carbon neutral maybe by 2025, 2028, 2030, whatever we actually decide our final demands to be? That might seem impossible, but it is actually what is necessary for life to exist on this planet. So we don't just ask for what is what is possible within the current realm of being. We actually ask for what is necessary, and we mobilize populations to achieve this. Our third principle and value, which to me is one of the most important reasons why I'm a part of XR, is that we need a regenerative culture. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of movements have burned out in the past is because they don't have this aspect built into them. And I see regenerative culture as, on a broader level, kind of being the space where we create the world that we actually want to live in. So not just waiting for that world to appear in the future, but actually building it in the now. And what does that mean? It means creating a culture that is healthy, that is safe, that is adaptable. So this is the group of people that will ensure that we have conflict resolution trainings, that we have nonviolent communication trainings, that we have a space to maybe discuss our eco-anxiety. But essentially, it's about creating care and building care into our XR chapters. The fourth is that we openly challenge ourselves and this toxic system. So again, the reality is that this entire system is toxic, and we actually embody some of those toxic values and ways of being, but we challenge ourselves to be better. So what that kind of means is we challenge ourselves to do things differently. Until recently, I wasn't really thinking so much about this, but I've made, within my own set of privileges and possibilities, I've tried to make changes to my lifestyle that allows me to live more honestly in this toxic system. So we encourage each and every rebel to openly challenge themselves on what they can change in their own lives. But even more importantly, we have to challenge this toxic system, because at the end of the day, those individual changes are all and well. But if I fall sick one day and I need to buy a cough syrup, and that cough syrup is still coming in a plastic bottle, I don't think I have the ability necessarily to skip taking that medicine. I have to buy that plastic bottle and I have to drink that medicine, which is why we have to ask for systemic changes, where we actually hold the producers and the people in power accountable for creating structures that are more just, so that we as individuals can make better choices. The fifth is that we value reflecting and learning. So we're really young movement. We have a lot to learn. There's a lot of people who've done things like these before. So we want to learn from other movements, and we also want to learn from ourselves. So we keep doing actions, we keep doing things, and we continually reflect and learn on them so that we can become better, because time is running out and we need to be effective. The sixth guiding principle is that we welcome everyone and every part of everyone. So we as a movement do not align with any part of the political spectrum, any type of social group, any type of identity. Everyone is welcome in XR, and every part of everyone is welcome, which also means that how much ever time you have to give us, how much ever space you have to give us, whatever you have to give is welcome. Although we really encourage everyone to give as much as they can, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and the climate crisis is not just coming, it's already here. And this is the fight of our lives. The seventh guiding principle is that we actively mitigate for power. So we try to break down hierarchies of power so that there's more equal and equitable participation. So what does this actually look like? I'll talk a little bit about our working circles and how we actually organize as a group, but every single sort of position is never filled permanently. If you are a representative or a coordinator, or you have some sort of label, that gets rotated to make sure that no one holds too much power, either because they have power in terms of knowledge or time or experience, or because of the position that they're in. So we make sure we actually take decisions that actually mitigate that power. And another thing is that we actually also make sure that the power structures that exist in our toxic system are also mitigated. So we try and be open and honest and vulnerable about communicating things like patriarchy or caste or other aspects of power that might be coming into our movement. The next guiding principle is that we avoid blaming and shaming. So we live in a toxic system, but no one individual is to blame for that. And so even though this is sometimes really, really hard, we often try and talk about it like this, is that if you have an issue, you kind of talk about the issue with the idea and not the person, because it really doesn't help the movement to kind of attack an individual, because we're all kind of trying our best, or that's what we come into the system with. And these are our last two of the 10 guiding principles, which is that we are a non-violent network. And that's really, really important. We use non-violence both because of the social science research that I mentioned before, but because it really is the most effective way of bringing about change. And the last one is that we are based on autonomy and decentralization. So sometimes this is a bit hard for people to wrap their head around. We don't have any leaders. We don't have any spokesperson. We are all a bunch of equal volunteers, and we all give what we can to collectively create the structures needed to challenge power. And how this looks in reality, I'm going to talk about in a slightly later when I'm talking about the working groups. Okay, so this is the third part of our XR DNA, which is our approach, right? What does actually nonviolent direct action mean? So it has 5 components. The first is that we are respectful. This is tactical, but it's also true of how we actually are, because we are a movement of love, which is that even if there are people who maybe it might be hard to be respectful to, which is police maybe when we're doing an action, or other people who are against us, we continue to stay respectful, and we never initiate ever any sort of an aggression, because it actually allows us to not be tackled as a movement. Because if we're disrespectful, people can point fingers at us and say, why should we listen to you? The second is an acknowledgement, which is that we are sacrificial, which means that being a part of this movement really does require some amount of time and energy to be given from our lives, which we know that everyone has very, different circumstances, but we ask that you give anyway. The third is that we are escalating, which means that we don't want to just do an action once a year and leave it at that. We actually want to keep escalating and keep putting pressure from the outside. So for example, in our first action, if 100 of us assemble in the streets, the next action we want maybe at least 200. We either escalate in terms of numbers or escalate in terms of approaches, but we continue to put pressure on the systems of power. The fourth is that we're disruptive, so that we don't just do things in our little corner, but we actually make sure that people take notice of us, because it's only when people take notice of us that actual real systemic change is going to come about. And the last is that we're nonviolent. So I think people have many different baseline thresholds for what nonviolent actually means. But we at XR define it as nonviolence towards any living creature. That's the baseline. And individually, each individual group of people who are taking actions can define what is nonviolent to them, which is that, for example, to some, maybe graffitiing a street might be nonviolent, and others to it might be violent. So we can have those discussions as a group. But the thing is, if you take action under XR and you are complying with the 10 principles and values, if you take an action, however you do it, you have to be open about it. So if you, for example, deface some property, you have to make sure you say, I did this because you had a good reason to do this, and you can't hide behind anonymity, unless of course you're part of a vulnerable population and you're at risk of threat by whatever structures that exist. Then there can be discussions had around that. But that's our approach. In short, nonviolent direct action. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of this presentation, which is kind of talking about how to join us. And this is when I say we are decentralized and autonomous. I want to talk a little bit about how that looks in real life. So on the national level, we have 7 working groups. Sorry, we have more than 7. We have 9 working groups. The reason I say 7 is because we have 7 active working groups right now, and we are hoping to expand into 9. So the first is regenerative culture, which I actually talked about when I was talking about the principles and values. The second is outreach and training. So calls like this, anytime an open meeting is held, anytime we're reaching out to new populations, that is done under outreach and training. And they also do training for nonviolent direct action or other resources. Media and communications is exactly how the movement is perceived from the outside. So all of our communications to the external world, our social media platforms, how we contact the press, that's all done by media and communications. The next is actions and logistics. So every time a direct action is taken, these are the people who are planning it. The next is finance. So finance doesn't actually exist yet. If this is something you're interested in, please let me know. Please let us know. Please sign up. But we're trying to set up structures so that we can actually get funding in order to continue doing what we're going to do. The next is legal, which is quite important, not just because we can do legal advocacy in terms of policy changes, but also because we want to ensure that we actually have legal trainings and people know their rights within this country. The next is political strategy and research. And these are the people who think about our demands, our long-term strategy. How are we actually going to convert our actions into our demands and achieve the political change that we want to achieve? The next is art, which is really as simple as it sounds. Anyone who is an artist or an aspiring artist who wants to add color to the movement, who wants to add a different way and a different perspective of doing and achieving our same goals, that happens under art. And the last is infrastructure. So everything that you're seeing right now, this platform that you're using, our communication platform, Mattermost, which I'll talk about soon, our website, all of this is handled by infrastructure, and they ensure privacy is absolutely central to our movement. So these national working groups are also replicated on the local level as much as possible. Especially as we grow bigger, we want to continue to make sure that these working groups operate, and each of these working groups are completely able to make decisions within a working group. So one working group trusts another working group to make the best decisions for the movement, and that's how XR works. That's what autonomous and decentralized looks like. And there's also these things called affinity groups, which is kind of your smaller immediate family. So if the movement grows maybe 200 people, you have a group of 5 to 6 people who you can trust and lean on. Now, there's different ways of getting involved, right? Not everyone maybe has the time to give to a national working group. So the first is occasional support, to financial support, to sharing on social media, to bringing friends along. Every time we have an open call, inviting someone, sharing things on our social media pages. The next is a supporter, which is that you maybe actively help the movement. So for the 6th, if you're helping out plan that or helping organize that in some way, that's kind of something that you can do. An active participant is someone who probably works within one of these working groups, at least at the local level. It doesn't have to be at the national level. An active organizer is usually someone who's a representative or someone who's a facilitator, who kind of coordinates each of these working groups. And the last is core coordinators. This is currently where I am at right now. My entire life revolves around this. So I spend most of my day, if not all of it, thinking about XR and how we can be more effective at what we're doing. So those are the different ways in which you can join. Now, the last aspect of our XR DNA is our short-term and long-term plan, really. And this is, at a glance, where we're headed towards. So you keep hearing me talk about 6th October. Some of us are really involved in this, and some of us maybe not at all. So different cities are doing different things in 6th October, and I really recommend you checking out your local chapter's social media profiles to find out more. But essentially, on the 6th, we're having a citizens' declaration of climate crisis, because our institutions, all of them, are failing to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we're finding ourselves in. We as citizens are taking it upon ourselves to do that in creative and interesting ways to make sure that the crisis is communicated and that we are telling the truth. And that bleeds into the International Rebellion Week, where different countries, especially the global north, are taking massive nonviolent direct action, and that's kind of in solidarity with that. Until December, our short-term goal is to continue to do this type of outreach, mobilize people around the country, and get our governments to actually get on board with declaring this climate crisis. And by 2020, we want to actually engage 3.5% of the population to get involved with XR and start engaging in strategic and peaceful direct action to achieve our goals. So that's our short-term and our long-term plan. And again, this is a work in progress. As we continue to grow, we will continue to reflect and learn about these things, as I discussed in our principles and values. All right, which kind of brings us to the end of this presentation, or the end of the open meeting, at least the part that I am talking at you all. I'm going to come back to the Jitsi platform and stop the recording that I'm making, and I'll take any questions and answers that you have. If you haven't checked it out already, I encourage you to check out our national social media pages, our website where you can find your local chapter contact details, as well as social media pages.